Here is Pennonia Bubblegum. And this definitely is a bubblegum pink for sure. Both the swatch and the chromatography made me think this was going to be unusable for writing. It holds the light pink tone through multiple papers, and yes, it does shade. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs as well as on the premium stuff. I like seeing the soft pink of this ink. For me, I cannot see even being able to use up a bottle of this ink. A full page of writing is just too straining on the eyes. But what a fun second color on the page. Worth another sample? Yes. Worth a bottle to me? I don't think so.
The pen for today is a Sailor My First Pen. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Bubblegum pink for sure. Now, the first thing to really point out, this very bright white paper, we see that, yes, you can read it. A full page becomes a little bit much. So I think it could make that good second color, draw some slight attention to an area, but a full page, definitely not. This does not feather, does not spread. It does shade decent enough, but look, congruent right here. Some of the word becomes very hard to read, but in the shading areas, it's much easier. It's nice. It's not full page writing nice. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Pennonia makes more than just one ink. Let's take a look at a few other inks from Pennonia.
Here is Pennonia Tahani Purple. Here is Pennonia Chestnut Brown. Here is Pennonia Storm Cloud.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade just as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. This paper, not being as bright a white, I think makes it slightly easier to read. Congruent comes across a little easier here than it did with the congruent on Clairfontaine. But it's not to say that it's easy to read the whole time, just slightly easier because the paper is more, it's not as bright a white. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. I was really expecting this to be affected by the tone of the paper. Absolutely not. We have an opaque ink here, but it is harder to read with this toned paper in the background. Otherwise, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread, shades just as well as it did on the other papers, just harder to read with this tone background. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, this smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine, not doing it any favors on this paper. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does shade just as well as it does on the Clairfontaine, does not stand out against the quad rule in any kind of a way, really disappearing into the background. This is the hardest it has been to read so far. This would be a bad choice on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more pink inks.
Here is Diamine Cerise. Here is Noodler's Bay State Cape Cod Cranberry. Here is Sailor Manyo Sakura. Here is Van Diemen's Tasmanian Robin Pink.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine, a flatter version of that tone, which is common for this paper. Now, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does shade a little less than other papers, does not stand out against the quad rule in any way. If you're a student using this for that bubblegum color, you need to stop it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page. Here is KWZ Brown Pink. Here is KWZ Warsaw Dreaming.
Here is Diamine Desert Burst.
Here is Vinta Mother of Pearl Nakar. The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We still get shading. In performance, this is a great ink to use on this paper. It is in tone that I would have a problem with this as a teacher. I would probably tell someone to stop using this ink because this could, if it's all of your work like this, be too difficult to read. And if it's difficult to read and you're a student, it probably winds up being wrong. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, so it does have that going for it.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The dry medium fine nib of the Sailor My First Pen does put down a light, fun bubblegum pink with generous bubbles of shading throughout. You can really find them. Off camera, I tried this in a very wet fine and nothing changed at all. So this is a dealer's choice.